Robert Baratheon's rebellion is one of the most compelling pieces of lore in George Martin's universe. On one hand, we have enough scattered references to piece together a general picture, but the full story has always lacked detail and unbiased perspective. Most of what we know comes through the memories of characters in the main novels, people who either lived through those events or witnessed them from a distance, often with their own axes to grind. Today, we are going to break this down properly: the political situation before the war, the key figures, the military campaign itself, and the aftermath that shaped everything we see in the main story. So grab something to drink, get comfortable, and let us get into it. To properly understand why the rebellion happened, we need to go back even further than the events that immediately triggered it. The Targaryens had ruled Westeros for nearly 3 centuries by the time Aerys sat on the throne, and for most of that time, their legitimacy rested on something very specific: dragons. As long as the Targaryens had dragons, the political calculus was simple. Even if every lord in the realm had united against them, they could not have easily toppled the dynasty. A dragon changes the math of any battle. Daenerys demonstrated this clearly enough when she arrived in Westeros with Drogon. Field armies simply dissolve in dragonfire. But the last Targaryen dragon died more than a century and a half before Robert's rebellion, and once that happened, the dynasty had to operate on the same terms as everyone else. Marriages, alliances, favors, debts, and the careful maintenance of a balance between the great powers of the realm. The moment you start burning that balance down, you are in serious trouble because you no longer have anything that makes you irreplaceable. Aerys II, called the Mad King, ruled for more than 2 decades, and in the final years of his reign, he dismantled that balance with remarkable thoroughness. The 2 most obvious counterweights to royal power were his own son Rhaegar and his long-serving hand of the King Tywin Lannister. Both men were far more respected by the nobility than Aerys himself. Rhaegar was everything a crown prince should be: educated, skilled in combat, genuinely interested in the welfare of the realm, and deeply admired by knights and lords alike. Tywin was the most competent administrator and military commander in a generation, the man who had turned the Westerlands into the wealthiest and most efficiently governed region in the realm. The prospect of those 2 working in concert was, from a purely pragmatic standpoint, exactly what Westeros needed. Aerys, whatever his madness, could see clearly enough that both men were more popular than he was. He could not tolerate it. His vanity curdled into something darker, and he spent years systematically pushing both of them away from real power. He humiliated Tywin, ignored Rhaegar's counsel, and created an environment at court so poisonous and chaotic that capable people either left or became deeply resentful. When Aerys finally lost Tywin entirely by refusing to pass the handship to Rhaegar, he had stripped himself of the 2 most powerful political and military assets available to him, and he had done it entirely by choice. There is a pattern here that you see in the histories of collapsing dynasties everywhere: a ruler who mistakes paranoia for strategic thinking, who conflates loyalty with submission, and who eliminates his most capable subordinates because they make him feel insecure. Aerys did not just weaken the Targaryens. He actively created the conditions for their overthrow. The Westerlands and the North represent 2 very different kinds of political problem for Aerys, and understanding both helps explain why the coalition against him formed the way it did. Tywin Lannister was the more obvious loss. The wealth of Casterly Rock, the military strength of the Westerlands, the administrative genius of Tywin himself, losing all of that to neutrality and potentially to outright hostility, was a catastrophic strategic mistake. But the Stark situation is in some ways even more interesting, because the Starks were never supposed to be a major political player in the first place. The North's geographic isolation gave the Starks a natural de facto autonomy that no other great house possessed in quite the same way. For most of their history, they had governed their own affairs, married within their own vassal families, and kept their involvement in southern politics minimal. Rickard Stark changed that. He began looking outward, seeking marriage alliances with other great houses, rather than keeping everything contained within the north. Whether this was simple ambition, a genuine strategic assessment of the dangers posed by an unstable crown, or some combination of both, the effect was to draw the North into a much larger web of relationships and commitments. When Lyanna Stark disappeared and the circumstances surrounding it pointed toward the royal family, Rickard and Brandon Stark rode to King's Landing demanding answers. Aerys had them both killed. He burned Rickard alive and strangled Brandon with a noose that tightened as Brandon tried to reach the sword that was just out of his grasp. It is difficult to imagine a more calculated way to create an implacable enemy out of an entire house and everyone connected to them. Jon Arryn was the third leg of this coalition, and his role is sometimes underestimated. Robert Baratheon and Eddard Stark had both been fostered in the Vale as young men, which meant their closest friendships outside their own families ran through Aeron. When Aerys demanded that Jon Arryn send him the heads of Robert and Ned, then simply two young lords who had not yet raised a finger against the crown, Aeryn instead called his banners and went to war. That decision transformed a royal tantrum into a genuine rebellion with a unified command structure. The Vale's knights were among the finest in the realm, and Aeryn himself was a steady, experienced political operator. The rebellion would not have held together the way it did without him. What strikes me about all of this is how unnecessary it was. Aerys did not have to make any of these enemies. He had a realm that, whatever its problems, was functioning. He had a capable son who could have handled most of the day-to-day governance. He had Tywin, who had quite literally kept things running for years. The road to Robert's rebellion is not a story of inevitable historical forces sweeping a dynasty away. It is a story of a man making a series of bad decisions, each one a little worse than the last, until the damage became irreparable. There is something almost mundane about it, which makes it more unsettling, not less. Now, let us talk about the war itself, because the military campaign of Robert's Rebellion is genuinely fascinating and deserves more attention than it usually gets. The fighting lasted more than a year in total, and the outcome was far less certain than it can seem in retrospect. Robert Baratheon became the figurehead of the rebellion, not just because of his personal charisma and fighting ability, though both were considerable, but because of his bloodline. He was a great-grandson of Aegon V through his mother, which made him a cousin of Rhaegar and gave the rebellion a dynastic legitimacy it would not otherwise have had. This mattered. Rebellions need a rallying point, and a man who can claim Targaryen blood is a much more compelling one than a man who simply hates the current king. The early phase of the war involved the separate mustering of rebel forces across multiple fronts, and it was messier than the eventual outcome might suggest. The North assembled quickly and efficiently. That is the kind of authority the Starks had over their bannermen. But the Vale and the Stormlands faced more friction. Gulltown held for the Targaryens, backed by Lord Grafton and reinforced by the Corbrays, and Jon Arryn had to fight his way through that resistance before he could bring the Vale army south. In the Stormlands, Aerys's handlord Merryweather sent orders to the Stormlords to resist Robert, and while this ultimately failed, it created early complications that slowed the rebel consolidation. Robert himself fought 3 engagements in a single day near the ruins of Summerhall, defeating forces under Lords Caffrey, Grandison, and Fell, which was the kind of dramatic individual performance that builds reputations and draws wavering lords to your side. The question of why Merryweather did not respond more aggressively in those early weeks is genuinely interesting. Aerys had allies in the Stormlands, and a more energetic response, substantial reinforcement of those loyalist lords, A serious effort to prevent the Stormlords from joining Robert might have contained the rebellion before it could spread. Instead, Merryweather handled it cheaply, sending orders without the troops to back them up. Whether this reflected simple incompetence, a genuine failure to grasp the scale of what was developing, or something else, the result was that Robert consolidated his position in the Stormlands faster than he should have been allowed to. The strategic picture, once the rebellion was fully underway, was complicated for both sides. The Royalists had significant potential assets. The Reach, historically loyal to the Targaryens and capable of fielding enormous armies. The Dornish, ferocious fighters, the royal treasury, and the formidable forces of Tywin Lannister, if they could be brought to bear. The rebels had the best infantry in the realm in the northern soldiers, the disciplined and well-equipped cavalry of the Vale, and the crucial advantage of interior lines. The Riverlands, roughly central in the geography of Westeros, gave them a base from which they could operate against forces coming from multiple directions. The alliance was also more politically coherent than the Royalist coalition, which depended on the coordination of a mad king who trusted almost nobody. The Royalists needed to do two things simultaneously: hold King's Landing and maintain the corridor to the south that allowed them to receive reinforcement from the Reach and Dorne. The rebels needed to prevent that corridor from functioning and bring the war to a decisive engagement before the Royalists could fully concentrate their forces. This is why the Battle of Ashford matters as much as it does, even though the rebels lost it. Robert was trying to slip north and link up with the Stark and Tully forces, while the Reach army was still moving through the Stormlands. He did not make it. He ran into the vanguard of the Reach army at Ashford under the command of Randyll Tarly, and the Stormlands force took a serious beating. What happened next is the most dramatic episode of the early war. The wounded and badly depleted Stormlands army retreated north into the Riverlands and eventually ended up sheltering in a town called Stony Sept. The King's Landing forces, under the command of a new hand and the ambitious young officer Jon Connington, caught up with them there. Connington understood perfectly well what was at stake. If he could capture or kill Robert at Stony Sept, the rebellion would lose its figurehead and quite possibly collapse. He searched the town house by house, systematically working through it while his forces controlled the exits. He came very close, but Robert was still there, hidden somewhere in the town, when the Northern and Tully armies under Ned Stark arrived and hit the Royalist forces from outside. The battle that followed was a decisive rebel victory. The Royalists were routed. Robert was never found. Jon Connington spent the rest of his life haunted by Stony Sept. In his own recollections, he described dreaming about it for 17 years, running through the town with a sword, kicking in doors, climbing stairs, jumping from roof to roof, while the bells of the Sept rang louder and louder until he could not think. He believed, and was probably right, that if he had found Robert that day, the entire subsequent history of Westeros would have been different. The Battle of the Bells, as it came to be called, was not just a military turning point. It was the moment the rebellion transformed from a regional uprising into a genuine civil war. After Stony Sept, every lord in the realm had to make a choice. The period between Stony Sept and the Trident was characterized by both sides trying to consolidate their forces and position for the decisive engagement. The Rebel Alliance formalized its political structure through a pair of major marriages at River Run: Jon Arryn to Lisa Tully, Eddard Stark to Catelyn Tully, which cemented the Tully commitment to the rebellion and gave it a solid base in the Riverlands. Meanwhile, the Royalists brought Rhaegar south from wherever he had been. The prince had been largely absent from the early stages of the war, which has prompted considerable speculation about his relationship with his father and his own intentions. Whatever his private feelings about Aerys, Rhaegar understood that the threat had become existential for the dynasty. He could no longer afford to stay out of it. The Dornish forces arrived, sent by Doran Martell out of obligation to the marriage alliance between Rhaegar and Elia. Mace Tyrell sent a portion of his forces from the siege of Storm's End, though the decision to maintain that siege rather than concentrating everything for the Battle of the Trident is one of the more puzzling strategic choices of the war. Stannis Baratheon and the skeleton garrison at Storm's End were not going anywhere. The forces besieging them could have been far more useful elsewhere. But military logic does not always win out over the desire for a neat resolution, and Mace Tyrell had his own reasons for wanting Storm's End neutralized before he committed fully. The Battle of the Trident was the climax of the war, and in a war of this scale and duration, it is remarkable how much turned on the events of a single afternoon. The Royalist army had the numerical advantage. Rhaegar commanded a substantial force that included Dornish soldiers and knights from several Loyalist houses. But the rebel army had the Northern infantry and the Vale cavalry, and those are very difficult combinations to beat in a pitched battle on open ground. When Rhaegar decided to accept the engagement, rather than finding a way to delay or maneuver, he was making a choice that the composition of his force could not justify. The rebels won decisively. Rhaegar and Robert met personally on the battlefield, in what accounts describe as an extraordinarily violent single combat. Robert's warhammer crushed the rubies from Rhaegar's breastplate into the waters of the Trident. The prince was dead, and with him, the last real hope of a Targaryen recovery. King's Landing fell shortly afterward, but not in the way anyone expected. Tywin Lannister, who had spent the entire war refusing to commit to either side, arrived at the gates of the city with the full Lannister army and claimed he had come to defend the crown. Aerys, whose paranoia had by then reached extraordinary heights, let him in. The Lannister army promptly sacked the city. Aerys was killed by Jaime Lannister in the throne room, while Jaime's own father's soldiers were burning the streets. The Targaryen infants, Rhaenys and Aegon, were murdered by Lannister men. Aelia of Dorne was raped and killed by Gregor Clegane. Robert, arriving to find the city already taken and the royal family already dead, accepted the situation and sat on the Iron Throne. What followed the war is in many ways as revealing as the war itself, because the division of rewards tells us a great deal about what the various participants actually wanted and how much leverage they actually had. Tywin Lannister walked away extraordinarily well. He had contributed nothing to the rebel victory. His army arrived after the Trident, and his supposed defense of King's Landing was a naked, opportunistic seizure that involved atrocities against people who were, at that point, no longer a threat. And yet Cersei Lannister became queen. Tywin embedded himself directly into the royal family, gained the prestige of the connection, and secured his financial and political position for a generation. This did not happen by accident. Robert needed Lannister gold and Lannister troops to consolidate his reign, and he was willing to pay the political price for them. The Starks received considerably less than their contribution warranted. Eddard Stark had arguably done more than anyone except Robert himself to make the rebellion succeed. The Northern Army was the backbone of the rebel force, and Ned personally led the decisive action at Stony Sept. He became Warden of the North, which he already was, and went home to govern his frozen domain and raise children who mostly died in horrible ways. Part of this is simply who Ned was. He was 20 years old at the end of the war. He had no interest in political maneuvering for personal advantage, and he was far more concerned with being loyal to his friends than with extracting concessions from a position of strength. Whether you see that as admirable or as a catastrophic failure of political judgment probably depends on how you look at things. From a purely practical standpoint, the North had enormous leverage at the end of the war, and Ned did not use it. Jon Arryn became Hand of the King, which was genuinely an appropriate reward. He had been the architect of the rebellion in many ways, the steady political operator who had built and maintained the coalition, and the handship gave him real governing authority. The Tullys strengthened their position substantially through the marriages made during the war. Robert got the throne, the wealth, the power, and Cersei, which he would later describe as having given him a lion and 1,000 enemies. The question of Tywin's motives throughout the rebellion is one of the most interesting unresolved questions in the whole story. He never definitively committed to the rebel side. He never openly declared for the crown. He sat in Casterly Rock with the most powerful army in Westeros and waited. This was not indecision. Tywin was many things, but indecisive was not one of them. He was watching. He was calculating. And when the moment came, he moved with complete ruthlessness and positioned himself to gain maximum benefit, regardless of which side had technically won the field. It is worth thinking about what Rhaegar represented to Tywin. Rhaegar had chosen Lyanna Stark as his second wife rather than taking a Lannister bride, and Tywin had a daughter of marriageable age and considerable ambitions for that daughter's future. The rejection was personal as well as political. Whether it played a role in Tywin's decision to let the war run its course without committing, we cannot know for certain. But the timing of his arrival at King's Landing, the comprehensiveness of the sack, and the deliberate targeting of the remaining Targaryens all suggest a man who had decided on a particular outcome and was ensuring it happened. The figure of Rhaegar himself remains stubbornly mysterious, and this is almost certainly intentional on Martin's part. We see him only through the recollections of people who loved him, hated him, or had complicated feelings that mixed both. Barristan Selmy's reverence, Robert's fury, Eddard's ambivalent sympathy, Cersei's resentment. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that Rhaegar was a serious person who took his responsibilities seriously, that he was aware of and deeply troubled by his father's condition, and that whatever he did with Lyanna Stark was not simple predatory abduction, at least not from his own perspective, whatever the consequences were for everyone else. The theory that he acted on some prophecy about the prince that was promised, the Song of Ice and Fire, is consistent with what we know of his character. He was not a man who did things lightly. He also went into the Battle of the Trident, knowing that if he lost, his entire family would be at the mercy of people who had very good reasons to want them dead. He fought anyway. The aftermath of the rebellion cast long shadows. The institutional consequences were substantial. The weakening of the small council, the accumulation of debt to the Iron Bank and to Tywin Lannister, the normalization of certain kinds of political violence that would have seemed extraordinary a generation earlier. The personal consequences were even starker. Ned Stark came home with a baby he claimed was his bastard son, a story that nobody who knew him really believed, but that everyone politely pretended to accept. Stannis Baratheon sat at Storm's End for a year eating rats and watching his garrison die of starvation, and the brother who rescued him was Robert, not Ned, and the brother who got rewarded was also Robert, not Stannis. Stannis never forgot. The resentment seeded in those years grew for almost 2 decades before they erupted in the War of the Five Kings. Almost every conflict we watch unfold in the main story has a root somewhere in the events of Robert's rebellion. Knowing the rebellion does not just satisfy curiosity about the past, it changes how you read everything that comes after. George Martin himself has been interestingly inconsistent about whether we will ever get a definitive account of the rebellion. For years, he insisted that a prequel novel was not something he planned. The main series would fill in the details through flashbacks and shifting perspectives, and a dedicated prequel would feel redundant once the saga was complete. More recently, he has softened that position, acknowledging that if the story took firm root in his imagination, he might eventually write something. The way the rebellion is treated in the world of Ice and Fire adds another layer to this. The in-universe historian Maester Yandel wrote his account under political pressure. first from Robert's court, then revising it after Robert's death in anticipation of whoever came to power next. Characters who posed a political complication to whoever held power at the time of writing were quietly minimized or omitted. Stannis, in particular, essentially disappears from the account of the rebellion despite having played a central role. This is Martin doing what he does best, making the unreliability of historical sources part of the texture of the world itself. We do not have a clean, authoritative account of Robert's rebellion, because no such account has ever existed. Every version we have is someone's version, filtered through their interests and their fears. That is how history actually works, and it is one of the things that makes the world of Westeros feel genuinely lived in rather than constructed. What is left unresolved at the end of all of this is the question of whether the rebellion produced anything better than what it replaced. Aerys was genuinely catastrophic, a mad king actively making things worse with every decision. Robert was personally brave and politically chaotic, a man better suited to fighting wars than governing the aftermath. The institutions he built were weaker than the ones he inherited, the debts he accumulated were crippling, and the alliances he made planted the seeds of the next catastrophe. The Stark children paid the price. The small folk paid the price. The Night's Watch, already underfunded and understaffed, got no relief. If there is a lesson in any of this, it is probably that removing a bad ruler is the easy part. Building something functional in the wreckage is the hard part, and it requires a very different set of skills than winning battles. Robert had the first kind of skill in abundance, and almost none of the second. The world of Westeros would spend the next 15 years dealing with that particular gap. And in a way, that gap is the entire premise of A Song of Ice and Fire. The story begins not with the rebellion, but with its consequences. A king who drinks too much and misses who he used to be. A hand who cannot keep up with the rot spreading through the institutions. Children growing up in a court poisoned by the compromises their parents made to end a war. The rebellion created the conditions for everything that follows. Understanding it is not just background knowledge, it is the key to understanding why the world of the story is the way it is, why the characters are the way they are, and why things go as wrong as they do as quickly as they do. The seeds of winter were planted in the heat of that war, and by the time we arrive at the story proper, they had been growing for 17 years.